Hello everybody, I'm Karen from Sew and Save, and I'm here today in my sewing studio here at the Ponderosa because I am working on block 9 of our Cat'aPult block of the month. We've been working on this all year at our Sew What Club that meets the third Monday of every month at Sew and Save in Racine, Wisconsin. So I hope you join us to work on this project. Every video is on YouTube, starting with month 1 through today, which is month 9. We'll put the rest of the months on as the year progresses. So we're getting there. Pretty soon we're going to be ready to sew our blocks together. But for today, we're going to work on block 9. And this is what block 9 looks like. It has your cat's cradle blocks, 4 of them, 1 in each corner. In the center, you kind of have a square and a square block. And then over on each end, in the middle of each side, you have kind of a half snowballed, half kind of sort of a flying geese elongated block that goes right in here. Super fun and simple to do, and we can get this done in no time. Today you're going to be using, of course, your cat's cradle ruler. And I also used my Quilter's Magic Wand, and I used this for drawing my little lines diagonally in my squares. It works great. So let's go over what fabrics you need for your project this month. You're going to start out with 4 little gold squares. These little gold squares are going to go in each corner of your center background square. Then you're going to need 8 little red squares. The little red squares are going to be kind of in that little elongated flying geese block. So you'll need 8 of those. You'll be drawing lines diagonally through each one of these blocks using your Quilter's Magic Wand. Then what do we have? Our background. So we're going to have 5 background squares, all cut the same size. So 1 will be in the center, and then 1 will go with 2 of each of those red squares to make your center squares on each corner and each end. Alrighty, then you're going to need the rectangles to make your cat's cradle block. And so these little rectangles are going to go into each of those cat's cradle blocks. You're going to go with the blue next. And the blue makes the triangle in the cat's cradle block. And then don't forget your brown squares. You're going to need 4 of those, 2 blues and 4 of your background blocks, but you're going to need 4 of these brown squares, which will go in the cat's cradle blocks as well. So the cat's cradle block is made up of the brown, the cream rectangles, and the blue squares. Okay, the center is going to be made up of 1 background square and 4 of the gold squares. And then each of these center blocks on the sides are going to be your background squares, 4 of those, with 8 of the red squares. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is make those cat's cradle blocks. So follow along and let's get cutting. Well, I'm all ready to start block number 9. I hope you are too. I have all my pieces cut and I have my instructions. And let's take a look at what we're making this month. We're going to make a set of 2 sets actually of the cat's cradle blocks. We're going to actually make 4 of these kind of elongated flying geese blocks and 1 center block, which is a square and a square. So the first thing we're going to do is start our cat's cradle block. Using your 4 brown squares and 4 background rectangles, you're going to sew these together just like we have every other month. You're going to sew 4 of those together and press each one away from your square toward your background rectangle. Then you're going to lay these together, right sides together, with the brown squares in opposing corners. Stitch 1/4 of an inch across the top, make your little clip, and then press again toward your background rectangles. we'll do that, and then I'll show you how to use the ruler to trim these up. So I have these put together. Sewed them 1/4 inch, pressed away from my brown squares toward my background squares, and I have my little clip in the center. Now I'm ready to add my blue rectangles to these, and we'll lay these. Okay, we're gonna lay this down, right sides together, and flip it so that I can see my squares in my background blocks. Get those all nicely lined up, and then we're going to use the ruler to draw our stitching lines. So get out our cat's cradle ruler. Again, we're going to line up the edge of the cat's cradle placement on seam line right onto the seam line of our square. And then we're going to draw a marked line right on the side where it tells you to on the ruler. So I'm lining up my placement line on my squares, draw my line on all 4, and then I'm going to stitch and use the ruler to trim this down. To add one more set of lines over here. Make sure that you sew right on this line, and make sure that this corner of your ruler, the placement line of your ruler, is right on the corner of that stitching line. As long as you do that, you're not going to either get too much fabric on the outside of that point, or you will not cut off your point. And that is what it's all about, isn't it, ladies? Get those points just pretty. Now I'm going to sew on each one of these lines, come back, use the ruler to trim my block down. I've stitched directly on the lines that I drew, and now I will use my ruler to trim these down and cut them down to size. I'm going to line up my little 1/4 inch seam. It says 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to line up that line right along the line that I stitched. And on both sides, I'm going to trim. Just trimming off, as you know, just a little bit. And I need my cutter to cut a little bit better than that, don't we? Might be time to put in a new blade. Okay, there we go. Or use a little bit more pressure. There we go. All right, we're going to trim this one. And that's all you're trimming off. We're going to do the same on this one. Each side, so that you end up with 4 triangles. These are going to go into each corner of your block this month. Trim all that off. Now we're going to cut it down to size. I'm going to lay my blocks so they look like little mountains in front of me. There we go. And grab my instructions, and my instructions tell me to use the 4-inch line on the cat's cradle tool to trim my blocks. So I'm going to use this side of my paper here, I'm going to line up this 4-inch line and this dotted line on my block. The 4-inch line will line up with my stitching line on the brown square. This dotted line will line up with the stitching line on my little triangle. So lining up my little 4-inch line on that little corner and lining up my dotted line on my stitching line, I'm going to take and trim all 4 of these down. So by having my blocks laid out in front of me exactly how I'm going to cut them, all I have to do is trim and pick up my ruler, lay it back down. Line up the 4, line up the dashed line on my sewing line, and trim. After that, I will take them over and press them toward the navy blue side. So mine are blue on this side, just like the instructions tell you, so you don't get confused as to what color I'm putting where. Line up your 4, line up your dashed line on your seam line, and cut. Oop, come on. There we go. Now I'm going to again take this, open it up, and this should measure 4.5 inches. I've got a perfect point right down to here, and I'm going to press my seam toward the blue and trim off my little dog ears. I have all 4 of my cat's cradle blocks done. I have them nicely squared up. All of the seams are pressed toward your navy blue triangle, and I've kind of trimmed off those little dog ears from sticking out, and they are ready to put in my quilt. I'm going to set those aside and go on to the next step, which is this kind of elongated flying goose block. So to do that, you're going to take 4 of your background squares and 8 of your red squares. You're going to take, I took my Quilter's Magic Rule and used that to draw diagonal lines through all 8 of my red squares. Then I took, and we're going to use 4 of these cream background squares. You'll have 1 left over, and that's going to be used in your center. I lined up my squares in one of the corners of each of those squares, and I stitched a scant, just a scant, I was going to say 1/4 of an inch, but we're not sewing 1/4 of an inch, but I'm just kind of a scant off of my line that I drew going toward my point over here in the corner. So I'm just stitching right next to my line as opposed to right on my line. So now that I've done that, I will take a ruler and use the 1/4 inch line on my ruler and trim those down and press toward the corner. Then I'm going to come back and we'll do the same thing in the other corner. So I have the first side of my little block sewn, and this time what I thought I would try is pressing that seam open. You know how up here in this corner it gets so kind of bumpy, and when you sew across this with your next seam, sometimes your seam gets distorted as you go over that bump. I thought I'm going to try pressing this open and see how it works. Right now this is so super flat, it's really, really nice. So I have then added my other 4 corners onto my blocks. Again, I trimmed them just a scant stitch away from the seam that I drew toward this point. And now I'm going to trim that off, and I'm going to press this flat again. So I use my ruler to trim all these off and trim this at 1/4 of an inch. Do that with all of them and press it, and then we are ready for the next step. So I'm going to kind of get you going on that next step as long as I have you right here. So we're going to do kind of the same thing as we did with these blocks with your center block. I have 1 center block, that would be your last cream background square, and then I have these 4 gold small squares. I used my Quilter's Magic Wand to draw a line diagonally from corner to corner, and now this time we're going to end up, instead of just doing these on 2 corners, we're going to end up going all the way around on this block. So when I go over to sew, I'm going to put 1 in one corner, then I will put the other in the other corner. I'm going to sew those 2 and trim them and press them, and then I'll come back and we're going to do the same on the other side. So I have all 4 of these all stitched on and pressed, and I press them again. I press these all open. Feel how flat that seam is. Can you even believe it? It's super flat, super nice. If I take my ruler and kind of take this little ruler has a little white kind of teepee on it, little triangle. From the point of this, where this intersects to the edge of the ruler is 1/4 of an inch. If I lay that right on my little square, I can see that I have a perfect 1/4 of an inch from this point to the end of the ruler from this point to the edge of my fabric. So I'm not going to be cutting off my points as I put my block together. So now I can set this aside, and I've sewn my 2 squares on either side of my background square. Sew them again askant just past the line that I drew, and here again I pressed this open, and it's laying beautifully flat, beautifully pressed. Now I'm going to put these in the opposite corners and finish off my little square and a square block. So this is going to go right here. Again, I'm going to stitch right next to that line towards the outside, towards your points out here. Then I'm going to trim them down 1/4 inch, press them flat, and we will be ready to put our block together. Now I finished my center block. Isn't that amazing? These are so flat. Can you feel it? Feel it. It's so flat and beautifully done. 1/4 inch I left on my seams and pressed them open, and I have 1/4 inch from my points out to the outside of my block. Now flip your page over and you are ready to sew your block together. So I'm going to take this and lay this out. So we are going to take and put our little center block in the middle and put our, making a kind of a little star block in the center. This is going to be a really cool one. Then the blue goes in the middle, toward the middle, I guess I should say, and your brown squares go toward the outside. Ooh, I like this block. Look how pretty this is. So I will start by sewing together the outside row, then I'll sew my middle row, then I'll sew my top row. So all 3 of these first, then we'll come back and we will sew them together and make our block all finished. I have my 3 rows all finished and sewed together. Now we're ready to add these to your center. I actually took and I pressed my seams open again to make them very flat. If you're concerned about getting your corners to match, you can press, I would press toward the outside, inside, and outside so those seams nest. But I think my seams are going to line up pretty darn nice. Now what I'm going to show you is how to get these points matching up and nice as you go along. What I do is I take and I flip this over, and what I line up my 2 little V points right here. These 2 little points, this little point to the center point of this one. And I stitch from here to here. Then I flip it over and check and make sure that they line up exactly the way I want them to. And then I will come back and stitch my entire seam. I don't rip this out, I leave it in because that's going to lock that in all nice and pretty once you get it all nicely lined up. And then I stitch all the way straight across. That way, if I don't like this, I'm just ripping out maybe 1 inch and relining this up and stitching it back again. I'm not ripping out an entire seam or from here to here and kind of stretching all that out. It's super simple just to pick out that little part, line it back up again, and get it nicely matched up. Then I come back and I sew my entire seam. And by doing that, it locks this in so that it doesn't move. You know, you can pin this, you can binder clip it, you can do whatever, but you'll start here and everything will shift by the time you get to the center and they'll be off. So get this locked in first, then stitch all the way across and finish your seam. So let's do that. And I'm going to, again, I think when I'm done, I'm going to press these seams open and I will have a nice super flat and beautiful block. So here is my beautiful month 9 block from our Cat'aPult block of the month. I hope yours looks just as fabulous as mine does. It was a lot of fun to do. And next month, we will be on month 10. We're getting there, girls. You have worked very hard, and I'm getting very excited to start sewing things together, but not quite yet. So enjoy month 9, and I will see you back here the second Monday of every month for our Cat'aPult block of the month. See you soon.